Breaking news here on RT International. Several civilians have reportedly been killed and dozens wounded after rebels shelled residential areas of the Syrian capital. The U.S. Secretary of State travels to Ukraine to discuss the de-escalation of violence in the east, all amid reports that Washington is seriously considering sending military hardware to Ukrainian government forces. As the red carpet is rolled out for the Greek leader on a European debt deal tour, the ECB tightens the screws on Greece's economy. And police in New York arrest a teenager in Brooklyn over his choice of emoticons in Facebook statuses. It's RT International live from Moscow. We start immediately with our breaking news story this hour. At least 3 civilians have reportedly been killed and dozens wounded by shelling in the Syrian capital. The attack is thought to have been carried out by a radical rebel group calling itself the Islam Army. On Tuesday, the extremist faction apparently warned it was preparing an attack on Damascus. The same group is believed to have been responsible for a similar strike which killed 7 civilians last month. This so-called Islam Army is not part of Islamic State or the more moderate Free Syrian Army. Let's try and get some insight now with journalist Willy van Dam, who's been following developments for us in Syria. Hello to you, Willy. Thanks for joining us here so quickly on RT International. What more can you tell us about the Islam Army group? What's their agenda and perhaps more importantly, who's backing them?
Good morning. Well, the Brigade of Islam, as it is called, is led by a Saudi called Zaron Alush, who is the son of a Salafist preacher in Saudi Arabia. So obviously, considering its past activities in the south of Syria, it's armed from Jordan and financed by Saudi Arabia. That looks obvious. Probably also very big American connections, certainly in the past. Now, the problem with the Brigade of Islam and Zaron Alush is that they are cornered. They are completely surrounded in the area where they are located, and the Syrian Arab Army, the official government, is cornering them, and they are making progress. And well.
So, Willy, if I can jump in, you're saying the Syrian government is making progress against the rebels, and also this brigade, this Islam Army is supported perhaps by Oman, by Saudi Arabia, as you say. But if I can ask you here, why is it then that ultimately that Damascus is unable, why Syrian government forces are unable to keep their capital safe right now?
Well, they've been there for several years now in that area, since 2012 somewhere, when they arrived there, and they're very well entrenched with tunnels and so on, and they're very well backed by arms and money and foreign jihadists, Salafist fighters. So the Syrian army has had difficulty, and they're a few kilometers from the city center, so firing rockets is not a big problem for them.
So as you say, Willy, I'm sorry to jump in, but you say the Syrian government's been making progress against this Islam Army, but the Islam Army has been receiving a fair amount of external support in the area in the past, in finance, perhaps in weaponry as well. One question for you, though, is that for the past couple of years at least, Bashar Assad, the Syrian president, has been the world's #1 bogeyman. That's according to 10 Downing Street. It's according to the White House. The world's been closely watching developments around Islamic State, but why has Damascus, why has Syria, why has it dropped from the headlines when Assad was such a bogeyman?
Well, there's a change of attitude in the United States and in the European Union and in some Arab countries. Until, let's say, a year ago, the bogeyman, the mastermind criminal, was Assad, and now you see in media, in Western media, the attention being more focused on the jihadist as the biggest danger. When you mention the word Syria fighter these days in Europe, There's a sort of hysteria going around. In the past, it was hysteria against Assad, and now it's hysteria against the Syria fighters. Until a year and a half ago, they were called, on the Belgian television, they were called idealists. Now they're terrorists.
Idealists, terrorists, freedom fighters, rebel fighters,
Yeah.
you name it, I suppose. What works good for a top worldwide headline? Do you expect widespread international condemnation of this shelling attack on Damascus?
Well, it could be hard to see at the moment how the West will react. It's, of course, a lot of hypocrisy. They've been arming ISIS, as I previously mentioned on RT. So it's a lot of hypocrisy. Now they suddenly realize that these Salafist jihadis are a danger. As Assad has warned them previously that they're going to face the Salafist onslaught on their own soil in Europe, in the United States, which is now happening, which is happening in Belgium, which is happening in France and in other countries in the past. So, and the problem for Alouche is he's cornered, and there's a rioting by the local population against his policies. There's infighting with other rebel groups. So it's revenge, you know. It's an act of desperation by Alouche. What has happened today and what happened a week and a half ago.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly see. We'll certainly see if the other global networks will give some sort of a condemnation or even coverage to the shelling today on Damascus. Several people killed, many more wounded. Willy van Dam, I wish we had more time. We don't. A Belgian journalist closely following the Syrian conflict and Arab Spring. Thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
The United Nations has once again raised concerns over the military escalation in East Ukraine, especially the increasing involvement of heavy artillery. It had already warned of a looming humanitarian catastrophe in the region. 5 people died in a hospital shelling in Donetsk on Wednesday. A kindergarten was also hit, though nobody was hurt at the time.
Подошел к больнице.
Сразу взрыв.
Начали бомбить. Когда девочка бежит, я открыл дверь, ее пропустил.
Ой, Господи.
Вот угол, вот, прямое попадание. А где
Я попроще.
The UN also backed a call from the OSCE, Europe's security watchdog, for a 3-day ceasefire in the Debaltseve area right here. They're trying to evacuate civilians from this fighting flashpoint. Now, a few thousand Ukrainian government soldiers are encircled in this region right here, the transport hub, with anti-government forces absolutely closing in on them there. The fighters from the self-proclaimed republics of the east say they now also have nearly full control of the nearby town of Ugolgorsk, just off to the west of Debaltseve. They're continuing to evacuate that area as well. The refugees who escaped the shells describe the current state of the town they've left behind.
Там ни одного дома нет целого. Пусть проклят будет этот Порошенко. У нас в Углегорске столько трупов валяется. Никто не выводит, раненые истекают кровью. Собаки таскают мясо. Никто не хоронит, потому что постоянные обстрелы. Ой, Господи, Боже мой, спасите хоть людей, которые остались, пожалуйста, повывозите их, пожалуйста.
Коридор дали 2 часа.
И 2 часа мы ехали под таким обстрелом. Я не знаю, мы 3-4 раза высаживали, детей прятали.
Now, the latest escalation in the region started in mid-January after Kiev announced a mass operation against Donetsk airport, breaking a previous ceasefire agreement. However, both sides had accused each other of violating the truce well before that. Now, on Thursday afternoon, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry will meet Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko in Kiev. They are expected to discuss ways to de-escalate the crisis in the east, though John Kerry's visit comes amid mounting reports that Washington is giving serious consideration to sending heavy weapons to the country. Here's Guy Nature.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is more than welcome in Kiev. U.S. officials have backed the Ukrainian government in everything it did from the outset. They've prompted Kiev to keep up the fight against the rebels in the east, and the Obama administration is now considering getting involved militarily by providing lethal assistance to the Ukrainian government. The U.S.'s next potential defense secretary says he supports the idea. There's a host of former U.S. and NATO officials who penned a report urging the U.S. government to supply weapons to Ukraine. They especially insist on supplying anti-armor missiles. The report also urges Washington to finance the Ukrainian military to the tune of $1 billion a year for the next 3 years. This would certainly get the U.S. heavily involved in the conflict in Ukraine. Whatever Kiev's strategic goals, those U.S. weapons will most likely end up killing scores of civilians. Washington has essentially so far turned a blind eye to where the Ukrainian government's attacks resulted in the killing of civilians. U.S. officials have only condemned the rebels' actions. We often hear U.S. officials say that they want a political solution in the conflict in Ukraine. But the question is, how could fueling the conflict with more weapons be consistent with that goal? In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chakyan, RT.
We spoke to Richard Sakwa, a professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. He also thinks diplomacy is the only way to restore peace.
The Ukraine crisis is one which has brought war back to the center of the continent, and we really must use diplomacy to find a way forwards. Russia has not been taken seriously, ultimately, since Malta. That was the moment when the idea of the Soviet Union and then Russia was lost as a genuine source of innovation and thinking on European security. This continental crisis, which we're now witnessing, is all about failure of communication, failure of trust, and of course, the attempt to delegitimate either side. For of course, now we see the demonization of Putin, we see the attempt to delegitimate the Russian government.
All right, still to come here on RT International. Beheadings, amputations, and stoning to death. These are notorious methods of punishment used by Islamic State, but Saudi Arabia also proudly practices and defends them as well. And a French anti-racism group launches legal action after an anti-Semitic job advert was posted online. Those details just ahead. For now, though, the European Central Bank has stepped up pressure on the Greek economy by suspending a waiver that had allowed Greece to swap its junk-rated debt for loans. The ECB said it was no longer able to guarantee there would be a successful conclusion to the Greek government's bailout talks with lenders. Now, this comes after EU nations rolled out the red carpet for Greece's new leaders on a European charm offensive. There are lots of friendly hugs and kisses with the new Greek Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras. First with the head of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who, despite friendly handshake, said talks would be tough. And then with the EU Commission Chief, Jean-Claude Juncker, who stressed Athens must stick to its obligations. An expert in political economics, Kostas Paniatkotis, told us and thinks that the ECB, at the end of the day, is quietly threatening Greece.
This kind of effective blackmail on the part of the European Central Bank has been used before with some effect in the case of Cyprus and Ireland. It seems like very soon we will reach at the sort of decisive moment when basically both sides will have to make a decision, and either they will reach a mutually acceptable compromise, or we could have cataclysmic developments that could threaten both the state of the Greek economy and the stability of the Eurozone.
American rating agency Standard & Poor's has downgraded some of Russia's biggest banks and companies. This comes right after the ratings agency found itself in hot water. It was fined $1.4 billion by the U.S. government for knowingly inflating its ratings of risky mortgage bonds in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis. But S&P is no stranger to major scandals. In 2012, Italy charged 5 S&P employees with mass market manipulation. And a year before that, politicians and bankers from Eurozone countries accused the agency of enormous political bias. Well, the agency recently dropped Russia's sovereign credit rating to junk, while China's largest rating agency, Dagong, put Russia's economic prospects at A. Earlier, Andrew Farmer spoke with Sylvain Rains, who used to work at Moody's agency but now is owner of an independent ratings firm. He explained why there might be such a large difference in estimates.